A resurfaced claim from a royal historian is generating fresh conversation about just how differently Kate Middleton and Meghan Markle were set up before marrying into the royal family. According to the claim, Kate had access to something Meghan reportedly never received: real time to live alongside her future husband and quietly absorb what royal life actually involves before the wedding day arrived. It's a comparison that's reignited interest in the very different paths the family's two most talked about daughters-in-law have taken, one continuing her work as a senior royal in Britain, the other having stepped back years ago to build a new life in California. Welcome viewers to my channel. Please subscribe, like my video and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. The claim comes from royal historian Marlene Koenig, who shared her perspective with the Mirror in comments that have since been picked up widely across royal coverage. Her argument centers on a lesson she believes the royal family learned the hard way, drawn from two of its most painful chapters: the marriages of then Prince Charles to Princess Diana, and Prince Andrew to Sarah Ferguson. Both unions, in Koenig's telling, suffered from the same underlying problem. The couples simply didn't have enough time to properly get to know one another before marrying, entering into a hugely demanding, highly public institution without a realistic sense of what daily life inside it would actually look like. According to Koenig, that painful history quietly reshaped how the family approached future engagements. Rather than rushing couples toward marriage, the institution began favoring a longer runway, one that allowed a future spouse to genuinely experience royal life before formally committing to it. Koenig points to two specific examples of couples who were given that extended adjustment period: Prince Edward and Sophie, now the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, and, later, Prince William and Catherine, now the Prince and Princess of Wales. Both couples lived together for an extended stretch before their weddings, which, in Koenig's view, gave the women entering the family a genuine, unfiltered preview of what married royal life would actually demand of them, long before they had to commit to it publicly and permanently. William and Kate's relationship in particular followed a notably unhurried timeline. The two met as university students and were together for close to a decade before marrying in 2011, a courtship that included a substantial period of cohabitation well before their engagement was ever made public. That kind of extended, relatively private runway, Koenig argues, gave Kate years to observe and adjust to royal life gradually, on comparatively low-stakes terms, long before the pressures of an official title and constant public scrutiny arrived all at once. Meghan Markle's path into the family, by contrast, looked very different. She and Harry met on a blind date in the summer of 2016, announced their engagement roughly a year and a half later, and married in the spring of 2018, a courtship of under 2 years from their very first meeting to their wedding day. By Koenig's account, the couple did not live together before marriage in the way Edward and Sophie, or William and Kate, had. That meant Meghan's introduction to royal life arrived far more compressed, with far less lived, everyday experience to draw on before she formally became a working member of the family. Koenig didn't stop at simply describing the difference in timelines. She went further, suggesting that Meghan's adjustment to royal life was genuinely difficult, telling the Mirror that Meghan was not comfortable with all of the institution's rules once she was actually living inside it. In Koenig's view, more time spent quietly observing royal life before marriage, the way Kate had, might have eased that friction considerably, giving Meghan a clearer, more informed picture of exactly what she was signing up for and a better chance to adjust before the demands of the role and the intensity of public attention hit all at once. It's worth being clear about what this actually is: one historian's interpretation, based on her own reading of royal history and patterns, rather than a confirmed account from the palace or from Meghan and Harry themselves. Koenig's comments reflect a widely held view among some royal commentators, but they're an opinion about a complex, largely private experience, not a documented fact. Koenig's comments also touch on a separate, long-standing thread of royal reporting: the claim that Prince William personally urged Harry to slow down before proposing to Meghan. According to those earlier reports, William encouraged his brother to take the relationship one step at a time rather than rushing toward marriage, a piece of advice Koenig frames as entirely reasonable given everything the family had already been through with Charles and Diana, and with Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, decades earlier. In Koenig's assessment, William wasn't being overly cautious or standing in his brother's way. He was drawing on hard-earned family history and trying to help Harry avoid repeating it. That advice, whatever its intent, didn't ultimately change the pace of Harry and Meghan's relationship. They married roughly a year and a half after their engagement was announced, and by most public accounts, moved from courtship into the full weight of royal life considerably faster than Kate had a decade earlier. It's worth pausing here to note that Kate and Meghan's situations weren't identical in ways that go well beyond simply how long each woman lived with her future husband before marriage. Kate met William as a fellow student at university, in an environment that, while not free of public interest, was considerably more private and low pressure than the one Meghan stepped into. Meghan, by contrast, arrived already established as a working actress with an existing public profile, entered the relationship as an American, and became the family's first mixed-race member to marry in, all factors that shaped both the intensity of media scrutiny she faced and the nature of the adjustment expected of her, regardless of how much or how little time she'd spent living with Harry beforehand. It's also worth remembering that Meghan and Harry themselves have offered their own public account of that transition, most notably in their 2021 televised interview and in later documentary and memoir projects, describing a rapid, at times overwhelming introduction to royal life and a level of media pressure they've said contributed directly to their eventual decision to step back from official duties in 2020. That account doesn't necessarily contradict Koenig's theory about cohabitation and preparation time, but it does suggest the couple themselves have pointed to a broader set of pressures, particularly around media treatment and institutional support, rather than simply the length of their courtship, as the central challenge they faced. Stories drawing a contrast between Kate and Meghan's experiences have become something of a recurring genre in royal coverage over the past several years, and it's worth thinking about why that particular comparison has so much staying power. Part of it is structural. The two women occupy strikingly parallel positions, both American adjacent in the sense of marrying into the same family around the same period, both arriving from outside traditional aristocratic circles, yet their public trajectories diverged so sharply, one staying and rising to Princess of Wales, the other stepping back entirely, that the contrast almost writes itself as a story. There's also a real appetite among royal audiences for explanations, some tidy, singular reason that accounts for why one relationship settled comfortably into royal life while the other didn't. Theories like Koenig's, framed around cohabitation and preparation time, offer exactly that kind of clean, digestible explanation. Whether the real picture is actually that simple is a different question. Human relationships, and the pressures of marrying into one of the world's most scrutinized families, involve considerably more variables than the length of time a couple spent sharing an apartment beforehand. Personality, media dynamics, individual family relationships, and plain circumstance all play a role too. To separate fact from interpretation here, it is well documented that William and Kate's relationship spanned close to a decade and included cohabitation before their 2011 wedding. It's similarly well documented that Harry and Meghan's courtship, from their first meeting to their wedding, lasted under 2 years. Those are matters of public record. What's considerably less settled is the causal argument Koenig is making, that the difference in preparation time meaningfully explains the different outcomes each woman experienced within the institution. That's an interpretation, offered by one historian, and it's the kind of claim that's inherently difficult to prove or disprove from the outside. Royal commentators, biographers, and the family members themselves have offered a range of competing explanations over the years for why Meghan's time as a working royal proved so difficult, everything from media treatment to institutional support to simple personality clashes, and Koenig's cohabitation theory is best understood as one entry in that broader, ongoing debate rather than a definitive answer. At its core, this story is less about a specific royal privilege, and more about how differently two women's introductions to the same institution unfolded, and how much interpretive weight commentators continue to place on that difference years later. Kate had the benefit of meeting William young, in a relatively private setting, and spending nearly a decade adjusting to royal life gradually before it became permanent and public. Meghan's path was faster, more compressed, and arrived alongside a level of scrutiny that, by her and Harry's own account, proved genuinely difficult to navigate. Whether more time living together beforehand would have changed that outcome, as Koenig argues, is ultimately something nobody can know for certain. What is clear is that the two women's very different experiences continued to shape how the public understands the modern monarchy's ongoing story, one still being actively written, all these years later. If you found this comparison interesting, let us know your take in the comments, and subscribe for more thoughtful looks at the stories behind the royal family's biggest headlines. It's worth actually unpacking what that near decade between William and Kate meeting and marrying really looked like, because it wasn't universally smooth or without its own pressures. During the mid-2000s, Tabloids frequently mocked Kate with the nickname, Waity Katie, a jab at how long she appeared to be waiting for William to propose while her own life, career, and public identity remained largely on hold in the meantime. The couple even broke up briefly in 2007, a split that was widely reported at the time and that added yet another layer of public scrutiny to an already highly watched relationship, before they eventually reconciled and continued toward marriage. That period wasn't without its own version of media pressure either. Kate was followed by photographers for years before any engagement was announced, and reports from that era describe intense paparazzi attention around her daily life, including her actual commute to work in London, well before she held any royal title at all. In other words, the advantage Koenig describes wasn't necessarily a peaceful, pressure-free runway. It was simply a different, longer kind of pressure, spread out gradually over years rather than compressed into a matter of months, which may be a meaningful distinction in itself. Gradual exposure to scrutiny, even if it's intense in its own right, arguably allows more time to adjust than a sudden, all-at-once introduction to global press attention does. On the other side of the comparison, it's worth being specific about what Meghan's own documented difficulties during her time as a working royal actually consisted of, rather than leaving it as a vague reference to not being comfortable with the rules. Meghan and Harry have spoken publicly, across a 2021 televised interview, a Netflix documentary series, and Harry's memoir, about a range of specific pressures, intense and, they've argued, racially charged tabloid coverage. Limited institutional support during a period Meghan has described experiencing serious mental health struggles, including thoughts of suicide during her first pregnancy, and friction over how much of their lives, including their son's early upbringing, would be shaped by traditional royal protocol versus their own preferences. Some of these accounts have been disputed or characterized differently by other royal sources over the years, and the palace has generally avoided detailed public rebuttals of specific claims, consistent with its long-standing preference for not engaging point by point with public criticism. But the broader picture that's emerged, from multiple sources over several years, points toward a transition that involved genuine institutional and personal strain, not simply a matter of Meghan being unfamiliar with etiquette or protocol. Koenig's cohabitation theory addresses one plausible contributing factor, familiarity with the day-to-day rhythm of royal life, but it sits alongside a much larger and more complicated set of issues that Meghan and Harry themselves have pointed to as decisive in their eventual decision to step back in 2020. Since Koenig singles out Edward and Sophie as another example of the successful cohabitation model, it's worth looking a little closer at their story too. Prince Edward and Sophie Rhys-Jones dated for around 6 years before marrying in 1999, a courtship that also unfolded with considerably less international media intensity than either the William-Kate or Harry-Meghan relationships would later receive. Sophie was, at the time of her engagement, working in public relations, and by most accounts, the couple's relationship developed with relatively modest press attention compared to what would come to define royal courtships in the smartphone and social media era. That's a meaningful difference worth flagging, because the media environment itself has changed dramatically across the decades being compared here. Edward and Sophie courted in the 1990s, largely before the internet-driven, 24-hour royal news cycle existed in anything like its current form. William and Kate's relationship unfolded through the 2000s, as tabloid and early digital media intensified but before smartphones and social media reached their modern saturation. Harry and Meghan's courtship took place entirely within the era of Instagram, real-time global paparazzi networks, and a fractured, highly partisan media landscape covering the royal family, arguably the single most hostile and fast-moving environment any royal courtship in the family's modern history has ever had to survive. Comparing how well each woman adjusted, without accounting for how radically different the media conditions were during each courtship, risks flattening a much more complicated picture into a simple story about who got more time to prepare. Zooming out even further, the tension between royal duty and personal courtship isn't new to this generation of the family at all. Royal marriages across British history have swung between periods of arranged, dynastically motivated unions and periods where personal choice was given considerably more weight, and the pressure to marry quickly, appropriately, and publicly has shaped royal relationships for centuries, long before tabloids or social media existed to intensify it. Queen Elizabeth II herself married Prince Philip after a courtship that, by modern standards, moved relatively quickly and included years of separation due to Philip's naval service, while facing its own institutional skepticism at the time, partly over Philip's background and connections. Princess Margaret's relationship with Peter Townsend, and her family's ultimate resistance to it, remains one of the most famous examples of the institution directly shaping, and in that case effectively ending, a royal romance based on considerations well outside the couple's personal feelings for each other. Seen against that longer backdrop, the modern shift Koenig describes, toward longer courtships and cohabitation as a kind of informal vetting and preparation process, looks less like a deliberate new policy and more like an evolving, informal norm that's shifted alongside broader changes in British society's own attitudes toward cohabitation, marriage, and privacy generally. Living together before marriage was itself far more socially unusual, and arguably far less compatible with the institution's more traditional image, in earlier generations than it became by the time William and Kate's relationship